When I was 15, all the way till up until I was 17, I made it a thing every single day to try and hike and walk as much as possible. During this time, my family and I lived in the state of Texas, and I commonly ran the Lewisville Lake Trail, which is roughly a 3+ mile hike. I actually lived closer to Denton than I did Lewisville, but I'm not here to argue semantics. So I tried to walk this trail at least every day, once a day if I could, sometimes more, all the way to and all the way back. That's around 6 miles on average. That will keep you in pretty good shape if you stay to it. I had been doing this trail for months on end and never saw anything that didn't really belong, as I would say, until one day I saw what I can only describe as a jackal-like creature. At least to me, it resembled that of a jackal, although jackals are very small animals. This thing was taller than I, whatever it was. So I'm walking down the trail, keeping a moderate to fast pace, when I hear some noise off in the bushes to the left of me. Not directly left of me, but up ahead, just a little bit. And I expected an animal to come out of the bushes, because that's what it sounded like. But then, just before this thing emerged, the rustling grew louder, and that's when I expected the possibility of a person to appear, like for whatever reason maybe they were hiding. I don't know. These are all the things running through my head in that 5-second time span before this thing showed itself. Then, not only does it emerge from the bush, but it takes a couple steps out directly onto the trail, stops in mid-stride, looks directly at me, right in the eyes, and just freezes in frame for a whole second. It was kind of like an "oh crap" moment for it. It's like it never really anticipated somebody being there on the trail, even though this was a public walkway, and anybody could have been out here walking. But I was in a portion of the trail that was more secluded by wilderness and trees and the thicket. I wouldn't say it sized me up, because I don't feel like it took the appropriate time to really look at me. It just locked me in the eyes for a couple seconds. Then, turned its head straight and continued like nothing ever happened, back into the other side of the brush, where it disappeared. I turned around from there and bolted back home, going double time. Even though this animal, I guess you can call it an animal, was taller than I, it was very skinny. Too skinny. It kind of reminded me of an animal or a dog that hadn't eaten in days. I didn't sit there and stare at every detail of it, so I can't say that I saw its ribs and its bones, but its build was just very, very slim. It almost seemed unnaturally scrawny, if you ask me. As far as the head, it looked exactly like a jackal. It had a little bit more seriousness to its eyes. I'm not sure how to describe it. The only thing I can come up with is that when it locked eyes with me, it seemed to have this intelligence, like it was reading me, reading my thoughts, trying to understand me as a person and as an individual. It might sound corny, but if I could summarize it, it's like it was thinking, this is a human being standing here. Just think of taking a jackal, standing it up, and then enlarging it till it's about 7-8 feet tall. The entire time it walked on its hind legs like it had no problems. It never once dropped down to all fours, and it acted more like a person than it did a dog walking around on 2 legs, which was very weird. It frightened me enough that it scared me off that trail for quite a few days afterwards, till I finally regained the bravery to go and do the trail again, which I never saw it after that. After multiple occurrences of doing the trail again, and not having any sightings of this thing, I felt like I got my bravery back. And so for the next few years afterwards, I continued to do this trail and build up my stamina and endurance with no problems. Although I'm not gonna lie, every single time that I headed to that trail after that sighting, I would always think in the back of my mind that this thing is gonna come out again, just because it was so out of this world. I'm now in my later 20s, and I still think about it from time to time, because it's not every day that you see an animal like that, or anything like that actually, that resembles a human that closely. I mean, maybe baboons or monkeys, but it looked nothing like that. This happened at nighttime. I was driving on Route 27, which is in Florida, and goes northbound to southbound. It gets pretty spooky in some spots because it gets so dark, especially when there's no moon out to help guide your way. This is the same night that I believe I saw a creature straight out of a nightmare. I come around a bend in the road, and I see a shape, something obstructing the road. I don't slow down because I'm trying to squint, and as my headlights illuminate this thing more, I realize it's an animal, but whatever it is squatting down on the road, and the closer I get, I can tell that whatever this thing is big. So I begin to slow down and press on my brakes, because whatever this is, I sure as hell didn't want to hit it with my car. Then, to my horror, whatever this thing was stands all the way up, fully erect, and this thing is towering over my car. I mean, we're talking 8 to 9 feet easily. When this thing fully stands up, the only thing I can see is its back. And then, this thing turns its head, and then fully turns around to face my car head on. There's no other explanation that could possibly be more simple. This was a werewolf, and if it wasn't, it sure played the part well. From head to toe, there wasn't a piece on this thing that didn't resemble a werewolf. When I've told this story before to other people, they'll always ask me, is there any movie that it looked like it could have came from? Like any other Hollywood werewolf that I could identify it to? And to be honest, I can't. But it also doesn't help that I don't watch a lot of werewolf movies, but I have a general idea of what they look like, kind of like most people. All I can say though, is that it did look very scary looking, and it even wore an expression on its face, like it was angry. Angry that I saw it. At this point, my car was at a complete standstill, my foot on the brake, and I thought I was going to die. In that moment, I was convinced it was going to come around to the side of my car, tear my car door open, and rip my throat out. But that's not at all what happened. Within a second, it leapt off into the road all the way to my left in a flash, and it was gone like that in the middle of the night. I just sat there, white. I think I might have even soiled my pants in the moment, but I can't be too sure. It is hands down one of the most scared I have ever been in my entire life. My brain tried to do the human thing and apply logic and reasoning to this scenario, but there's no logic and reasoning that you can fit into this application. A person in a costume doesn't get to 9 feet high, doesn't have the build, and doesn't look like this. This thing looked far more real than CGI ever could achieve. And there is no Hollywood costume that looks that real. And once it leapt off the road, well, I know for a fact, no athlete can jump that fast or move that quickly of that size. When I say it was gone in a flash, I literally mean gone in a flash. And why it was sitting in the middle of the road, crouched down, facing the opposite direction as my oncoming car, I have not a clue. Maybe it was waiting for somebody. Maybe another oncoming car. I don't know. After sitting there for a couple of seconds, in complete and total shock, a dangerous thought came to my mind. What if it's coming back? So I quickly and frantically pressed on the acceleration pedal and got out of there, faster than what the speed limit was. But folks, that's not where my horror story ends. It gets even more terrifying. In some sort of demented quest to put logic and reasoning to what I saw, I tried to do some research, but that research only led to more questions. See, I stumbled upon this thing called Dogman encounters, and in that, I found an encounter with an individual who just so happened to be traveling the exact same route, Route 27, and saw almost a nearly identical creature that I did. This creature can be found on Dogman Encounters, which from what I read is owned by a man named Vic Cundiff, and I don't know the individual's name that this happened to, but as soon as I read that encounter, I had chills all over my body. In the written encounter I read, this creature, which I believe was the same one, was eating a dead carcass of a cow, I think, or something like that. I feel like the answers I found only led to terrify me and traumatize me even more. And now, when I sought out looking for answers, looking to ultimately disprove what I saw, I only ended up believing even more. And now, I'm more scared than I was on the night that I saw this thing. To know that there's a possibility that there might be far more of these things out there, lurking around in the darkness, waiting to attack some unsuspecting driver when they least expect it. What if this thing had been planning some sort of attack? A million things ran through my mind once I read that, and I realized that I have to get my story out. I don't know anything about this subject, but I feel that sharing what I went through is important. You know, if you would have told me years ago that werewolves from movies were actually based on real living creatures, I would have laughed at you and probably mocked you. But now that I know the truth, assuming they are based on real living creatures, these things, whatever they're called, I think you call them dogmen, whatever, I could care less what they're called or even what they are. I just know I never want to come face to face with one of them ever again. I went fishing with a buddy a few summers back by a creek we always like to visit. It's a great spot, and if you trek in just a small way, you'll reach a spot that not many know about. It's got plenty of shade and plenty of fish, too. It's been a favorite spot between my buddy and I for quite some time now. We've been going to it for years. This time we showed up there was something there. I don't know how to put it into words other than a wolf-man hybrid. I know it might sound crazy, but that's exactly what this thing looked like. We're coming up to our fishing spot, and both my friend and I stopped dead in our tracks. We saw it before it saw us. We still had our fishing poles in hand, maybe not even 50 yards from the spot. It was in our spot, kneeling down looking into the river. It looked like maybe it was going to grab a fish. After a second or two, it lifted its head up, sniffing the air, and turned to look at us. That's the first time my friend and I really got a good look at this thing, whatever it was. Its size alone was intimidating, to say the least. It freakishly resembled the werewolves of the underworld movies quite well. It stares at us for a second, then jumps off across the river and the trees, and then it's just gone. Never made much of a sound. For something of that sheer size to just gracefully go through the woods without noise is otherworldly. My friend and I stood there with our jaws on the ground, wanting to know what the hell was that thing. We were a little shaken up, but mostly just in sheer shock of what happened. We spent the rest of the day fishing and talking about it, hoping it would come back so we could get a better look at it. It never did. We have been back to that spot since then and have never seen it again. I almost wonder if it was trying to grab a fish and we spooked it by coming up on it. I don't know how it didn't hear us beforehand. We were casually having a conversation and walking with equipment on, not being mindful at all of trying to be quiet. Let me just say that I trust my dogs with my life. Their instinct is far better than mine, and if they sense something, then I trust it. The thing is, my dogs only really freak out when they sense another dog around, so I tend to keep them by themselves most of the time. I had 3 dogs, and then my third one vanished. I have a Rottweiler mix and a lab, and then I had a smaller weenie dog. The small dog was my late wife's. She just passed away about 2 years ago, so it's just been me and the dogs since then. Our neighborhood is relatively small with only a handful of surrounding neighbors. It's quiet most of the time. I let my dogs out to go pee and sometimes just to hang out, get fresh air, that sort of thing. The weenie dog was already outside and had been when this happened. He spends most of his time out in the yard. That's where he likes to be. It's usually just my 2 dogs and me in the house. Well, this one particular night, I went to go let my dogs out and they started acting funny. They were whining. Faintly, but they were still whining. I thought, what the heck? They never whine and not go out. I tried to make them go outside. The door was open, but they just refused. I thought they were acting real funny when their hair started standing up, and they went from whining to acting nervous and being hostile, both their eyes darting around outside the window and around the house. What the heck had gotten into them? I thought. They both started barking up a storm, and here I am yelling at both of them to stop their hollering before they wake up the entire town. Just then, something slammed into the side of the house so hard it knocked me over. Things off my shelves fell, furniture had fallen. I thought somebody drove into the house. My dogs are going apeshit at this point, which they never do. Like I stated earlier, they never act up unless there's another dog around. I should have thought about that. I go running outside thinking somebody crashed into the house somehow. I run outside, it's pitch black. I'm not outside for more than a second before I am greeted with the deepest rumble I've ever heard. After a second of processing the sound, it was a growl that came from a huge animal. That's when the smell hit me. The thick smell of wet dog and urine. It was so strong, like I had just walked into a large cloud of it. I ran back inside the house and slammed the door. My mind is racing a million miles an hour, trying to think of what to do. My mind went to my weenie dog, how he was outside when all this was going on. I started to fear for him, thinking I should go play hero and run out and grab him. I knew there was something outside my small house. I don't know what though. I didn't feel adequately safe enough to brave it. After a while, my dogs did calm down, but the eeriness still lingered in the air. It was late at night, and I struggled to find any rest. Eventually, I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion alone. The next morning, my dogs woke me up, licking my face. I worried about the weenie dog, and I ran outside and he's nowhere to be found. I called his name over and over, and didn't hear him or see him, or any signs of him. I took the time to look around and saw no trails of blood, or tracks or anything that showed the dog was taken. The dirt around my house is very soft and light. My dogs and I always make tracks. We spent some more time looking over by the house when we heard the sounds last night, and what do you know? We found canine tracks. These tracks were double the size of my dogs. They were massive. I knew in my head that we had some large dog here last night. That would explain the urine and wet dog smell. It also explains why my dogs were freaking out. I just think it was some huge wild dog, but I don't know. Those are very big prints for a canine. The largest I've ever seen. I figured a wolf. A huge wolf. I wasn't too concerned about that in the moment, more so finding my other dog. I spent the better part of a few hours trying to track him down and couldn't. Put signs up around the neighborhood looking for him, and nothing ever turned up. I fear that whatever dog it was that came in my backyard that night took him. Considering the obvious size difference and the fact he's so small, I don't think he stood a chance. It's hard for me because that dog meant a lot to me. I recently took this girl out that I've been seeing for a few months now, since the fall. I took her out to my city's waterfront, which is beautiful, by the way. Even in the wintertime, when there's not really many people around, it kind of makes for a little more romance. As we're sitting there, chit-chatting on the bench, she looks over and points off in the distance. She and I both double-take as we have to make reel of what we're seeing. Far away is this really big person with the head of a dog. The legs even looked like a dog. It was dark in color. I couldn't tell from that far away. My date and I just sat there and gasped in awe at what we were seeing. This was a real-life creature in the flesh. It was darting back and forth between the trees, acting somewhat stealthy. There's seldom lights over in that direction, but it just so happened to be in the right spot and looking at the right time to catch it. It looked to be this big shape moving around, which would sometimes move close enough to the light to be able to make out minute details. Again, from the distance, things were kind of hard to tell for sure. I don't know much about things that go bump in the night, other than it was as spooky as it was interesting. My girlfriend and I still talk about it sometimes, trying to guess what it was. I was coming home one night from hanging out with a few buddies for dinner and some drinks. I spent some time at the bar with a couple of old friends that I hadn't seen in forever. So we had dinner, had a couple beers, and catched up for a while. Eventually, we left the bar at around 2 in the morning, heading home and wishing each other well. I'm beyond sober at this point, since I stopped drinking at around 8 or 9 because I didn't want to be anywhere near intoxicated on the road. I get to my house, I think it was around 2:18 in the morning. Where my house is, I have a long concrete driveway. I mean, I guess not really long, but enough you could fit 4 cars until you get to the garage door. On my right side is nothing but tall hedges. For height, I would estimate maybe 12 feet. They spanned the entire length of the driveway, up past my house. I'm getting out of my car, and I'm walking up the driveway. Before I continue, I should state that I park my work truck, so I was parked behind that. This meant I had probably a 30-foot walk to my front door. I'm getting out of the car. It's dark and quite late. It's quiet around 2. I turn to lock my car, and that's when I notice this head staring at me. My eyes, still adjusting to the darkness around me, had to squint to fully make out what I was looking at. I see the silhouette shape of a dog head. German Shepherd, as a matter of fact. Then I see these faintly glowing amber eyes just locked onto me. As soon as I digested the fact that it was indeed a dog head that was that high up in the hedges, and those were its eyes, this awful wave of dread just washed over me. I felt my blood run cold. I turned around and got to my front door faster than I ever have. I'm no runner by any means, but I felt like I could have won a gold medal on the track team. I locked my door and stayed up for hours waiting for whatever it was that I saw to show itself. I never saw it reveal itself. I watched and watched from my window and never saw anything. My front porch light was enough for me to see if there was anything to come out of the hedges. Due to the angle, I couldn't see anything inside of the hedges. Where I was looking was straight down my driveway through my front window, so the hedges were perpendicular to the window. I've told this story to some of my close friends and they just laugh. Honestly, I don't know what it was. The overall size of the thing's head wasn't normal. It had the shape of a shaggy dog and resembled a German Shepherd, but I know those dogs don't get that big. Plus, I had to look up at these eyes, which no dog that I know has glowing amber eyes like that. It wasn't dramatically glowing, but glowing enough that it looked demonic and caught my attention. I just knew deep down in my gut that it wasn't a dog. It was something else. I believe it was a demon of some sort. I'm not a religious person, but what I felt in that moment was pure evil. My granddad has some wild stories to tell. I thought I would share some of them with you. For starters, my granddad lives in Kansas, always has. I think he farms quite a bit out there, but I'm not too sure. We speak sometimes on the phone, so I try and pull as much information out of him as I can. My grandfather is a pretty laid-back guy. It really does take a lot to set him off. Touch one of his tractors, though, and oh man, it's a big deal. His tractors are his pride and joy. I think he has such fond memories of himself riding with his dad and granddad when he was a little boy. Either way, he spends a lot of time on them, and he loves doing what he does. My granddad owns several acres of land he uses and tills and plants a variety of plants and such. I don't know exactly how many acres, but I know he uses many of them for growing things. This is important because it has to do with the story that he told me. Near one of the fields he was out tilling with his tractor. He noticed some sort of strange whistling coming from the tree line near him. He stops his tractor and turns it off to get a better idea of what was making that noise. Out of the woods suddenly jumps this massive Anubis-looking dog creature. That's how my granddad describes it, Anubis-looking. He said it pounced on the tractor. It came out of the trees like a lioness jumping in the air on a gazelle. He said he was so frightened he nearly fell off his tractor and made a beeline for his house. This creature jumped onto his tractor and started tearing the engine out through the side with its claws and jaws. Said it's so big that when it landed on the tractor, he was nearly thrown off himself. He fled for the house and grabbed his shotgun, preparing to kill whatever big Egyptian animal had just attacked him and his tractor. He goes back out there, and this thing is gone, but his tractor's engine was torn halfway out of the tractor and destroyed. Some massive Anubis-looking animal jumps out of the tree line and tears through metal and steel into an engine. My granddad felt like he was going to be called insane if he told anybody. Nothing has that kind of power. And how was he going to talk about this with anybody? At that moment, he had an epiphany that a mere 12 gauge isn't going to do anything to something like this. As scared as he was going to defend his farm and his life. Leaving the tractor there, he didn't come back to that area of his property for days afterwards. He was going to have to get his truck back from his brother, who was currently borrowing it. The truck, I don't remember a make or model, was the only way he was going to tow that torn up tractor away from the area and finish tilling the soil. He had to continue tilling it. Days passed, he got the truck back. Keep in mind at this point, he's living in tremendous amounts of fear and anxiety. His prized tractor was torn up by some sort of mutant dog creature that could tear through metal. He was a mental mess, he told me. Anyway, when he braved up enough to go back to that area to lug the tractor over to his barn is when he saw them. He's driving his truck, stops by the tractor, and tries to make it as quick as he can. He doesn't want to hang around longer than he had to. He parks and starts to get equipment out of the bed of his truck and notices the stillness around him. This makes him even more uncomfortable. Before he could fully finish that thought, though, he hears a noise behind him. Turning around in response, he is shocked at what he sees. He collapses, smacks his head on his tailgate, and falls unconscious. What he saw, not even 20 feet away from him, were two of the same creatures he just saw a week ago, who pounced on his tractor. There were two of them, but they weren't the mammoth-sized version that he had seen. These were smaller, shorter than him even. My granddad is probably 5'6" on a good day, so these must have been a little smaller. He said they looked young, and that they were probably the creature's kin. Even their features that resembled the creature he had seen, but much more undeveloped and juvenile-like, if that makes sense. They gave him a menacing, intense stare that he believes was set out to intimidate. It scared him so bad he lost his balance, fell, and hit his head, knocking him out in the process. He woke back up and said 12 minutes had passed, judging by his watch. He immediately remembered what he had just seen in the trees. Looking around in a panic, there was no sight of the Anubis-looking beings anywhere. But his truck was gone. My granddad, who is near having a heart attack from fear, just lost his mind. He thought he was going insane. His truck that he had kept running, placed in park, and opened the bed to get supplies out, was now gone. There were no traces of it. It was evident that in the partial soil, the tire marks he had made when he drove up to the tractor. If anyone had hopped in this thing and drove it off, you would see tire tracks in the soil. It was impossible not to have tracks. There were none. It was as if this truck had simply vanished into thin air. The other problem with this is my granddad lives alone, and his nearest neighbors are a mile in either direction. One is an older widow in her 90s. The other is a younger couple in their 40s who raise livestock. The spot in this acreage is where all of this took place, and it's far back behind his house. From the back of his house, you can't see where he is at the time, since it was over a small hill. His driveway is also very long and winding.
Again, you can't see his house at the base of his driveway, and you can't see where he was by his house. This means that somebody had to have gone all the way up his driveway without him knowing, and by his house. Then, knew that my granddad was back in that part of the land, came all the way out there, saw the truck, saw that he was unconscious, drove it off the plot of land with no tracks, footprints, or signs of ever being present. It wasn't physically possible. Again, there would be tracks. You would have heard something or saw somebody. My granddad runs as fast as he can back to his house, calls the police, and only explains part of the situation. I was working, slipped and hit my head and knocked myself out. When I awoke, my truck was gone. The police showed up and investigated a stolen vehicle. They checked in around the area, they checked in with his brother, and nothing. Nothing ever did turn up. My granddad started losing it and began feeling like he was on the verge of a psychotic meltdown. Trying to cope and think about how to move forward with his life, he began seeing these creatures come around his land and close to his house. This is when he really felt the need to try and upgrade his weaponry. My granddad had some close buddies of his that served time and somehow had access to weaponry they shouldn't have had access to. It was more of a don't ask, don't tell kind of policy, I was told. They had live grenades, 50 caliber machine guns, poison gas, mines, all sorts of things. My granddad decided against using heavy weaponry, against these things, because he feared for invoking their wrath. He began to let his farm wither away, in fear of going out and being attacked by these beings. They would randomly appear on his farm, sometimes showing up in the dead of night. They would knock on his windows and peer in. Other times, he would see them walking up to his house in broad daylight, and then vanish. He ultimately didn't know what to do, but kept his trusty shotgun next to him at all times. He never ended up firing any weapon at these things for two main reasons. One, he feared it would only invoke their wrath upon him and his house. He wanted none of it. And two, he knew his shotgun would probably only tickle an animal that was that fierce and enough to take down a tractor. He knew that if he had shot at the younglings, he probably wouldn't be alive much longer. He restrained out of fear, but understood if they broke into the house, he was going to go out guns blazing. He said sometimes he'd get up early in the morning and see one of the younglings looking in his window. These things were so close to the window, they were making condensation on the glass. I asked him about the description of these beings, and to describe the best he can. He told me they were very dark in color, but the younglings were lighter. He said their face looked very pointed and straight. He said it was like seeing Egyptian mythology in living flesh. They looked exactly like Anubis. Black, dark fur, very short fur, enough that you can see defined muscles, a Doberman pinscher-like head, and a face with a human torso and body, legs like that of a dog, but walking upright. No tail. When he's telling this to me, the first thing that comes to my mind is The Mummy Returns, the movie that came out back in 2001. It has The Rock in it playing the Scorpion King, and Brandon Fraser as the main character. There's a couple of scenes where it shows these Anubis-like beings. I showed my granddad screenshots of those creatures from the movie, and he said the resemblance was close. However, the beings he saw looked eviler and had a wild animal look to them. Their eyes were a striking and intense amber color that seemed to give off a faint glow by themselves. Kind of like neon colors do, but in a different way. Each tooth in their mouth was yellow and looked rotted. Each tooth was razor-sharp tipped. My granddad made an observation that it looked like these things had multiple rows of teeth in their mouth, almost the same way a shark does. The intensity on these things' face and the feel they gave off was everything but benign. Their intelligence was something on an entirely different level. These weren't just animals. These were advanced beings. The way they looked at me, it's like they were reading my thoughts. It's like I knew that they knew that I was afraid. Speaking of fear, you knew when they were around or outside the house because you would feel it. The air would get thicker, harder to breathe. There would be times the air would be full and thick of static electricity. Multiple times did these things press their face against the windows, tapping on the glass, almost as if to taunt him. They would bare their teeth and grin at him, or just watch him intently. It's like these beings were there to incite fear and to try and intimidate and scare him away. That's why he kept mentioning the intelligence of these things was astounding. To give some more details to exactly what he talks about when he says that he saw them, he is referring to the two small Anubis-looking beings. He told me after the story he never ended up seeing the large one again. He wondered if that was the alpha male, or the pack leader, or the father or mother. He thinks it might have been protecting its younglings, whatever on God's green earth it was. It's the only thing that really makes sense to him. They must have been passing through in that area, and it's possible he just got a little too close and Mama or Papa attacked. He attempted different means of trying to protect himself. He got his brother to come out and told him he was having bear problems. His brother laid out several active bear traps all around the property, dug different hole traps, covered the bear traps, and set up about 10 to 12 game cams around his property. My granddad never left the house during this next week, out of fear of these things showing up. Brother came back to check on the traps and the game cams, and noticed that all the traps were gone. No idea where they had gone or who took them. All 8 of the bear traps that he placed around the area were gone. Every game cam was gone too. No traces of them anywhere. Now his brother is freaking out, and at this point hadn't yet seen these Anubis beings quite yet. As his brother is off collecting, or trying to collect any trap or game cam he set out earlier, is when he felt like he was being stalked. He said he felt like a large predator was around and following him. He suspected it to be a mountain lion at first, but wasn't too sure. He kept a pistol at his belt at all times, just in case, to deter any unwanted animals. He shot it up in the air to try and scare away anything that was around. That is when he heard a low snarl from behind a tree. He pointed his pistol, ready for whatever was behind. Out steps these 2 canine beings, the same ones my granddad had been seeing. These beings come out of the brush and come toward his brother. His brother fled, never said anything to my granddad, and just left. Whatever these things were, they were causing him serious issues. He told me he felt desperate and not sure where to turn to try and rid these things off of his land. He had called the police for an intruder on his property, and they had basically told him to just install security to help. After these beings constantly being around his property, he decided to go stay at a friend's house indefinitely. The house is paid off in full and has been for a long time. Letting it sit there for a while isn't going to be too bad. But he decided after staying at this friend's house for around 2 weeks, it was time to tough things out for the better. Upon coming back to his house and land, for the first time in a while he said he felt a sense of peace. Listening closely to his surroundings, he could hear birds chirping in the distance. This gave him hope. After a few days, things seemed to have calmed down. Perhaps these beings moved out of the area. He's not sure. Eventually, weeks went on and there were virtually zero sign of these beings being around at all. He even was able to borrow a truck to get his tractor moved and bought a newer one. His farm went to hell for a while because he wasn't able to maintain anything. He had to start over for a lot of things. He never did find what happened to his truck, game cams, and bear traps. He felt like he could finally start over again, and he did. He still lives there to this day, and says he hasn't had a single encounter with anything that stands out. Normally I'd call him a bullshitter, but he's a stern, serious individual. He would have put so much time into faking the story. When he told it to me, he spent a couple of hours diving into every little detail. So, I apologize for only writing to you what I can remember. There's no way he would have just come up with something like that. I am also an avid cryptozoology researcher, so when he told me about this happening, I just wanted to hear more. I believe, based off his account, that it is indeed a form of Dogman. When I kept asking for him to describe these beings to me, He just kept pointing back to the Anubis Egyptian god. This only happened 12 years ago. This was almost a year ago. It happened in mid to late April of 2019. On my drive home from working a long day, I came across a sharp bend in the road where out of nowhere, a deer jumps out in front of my Dodge Ram and I collided with it. I don't know why, but its momentum must have propelled it a certain way because it shot off to the side of the road instead of over my truck. My truck did a little glitch thing. Everything turned off and right back on within a split second, like the car or engine malfunctioned. The impact was hard and felt like it damaged my front badly by the impact alone. Shit, I told myself, quickly pulling over into the pullout right next to me. I jumped out of my truck, eager to see if there was really any damage. I had my nifty little utility flashlight with me, so even in the dead of night, I was able to fully check my truck for any serious markings or damage. It looked fairly clean. Nothing too bad was done to it. I was very surprised considering the impact itself was immense. After taking a few quick moments to scan my vehicle, I turned to my left, and directly where my headlights were hitting was the doe I just hit. She was a big son of a gun. I must have hit her good because her head looked pretty smashed in, blood oozing out the side of her face and mouth. I was doing a good 50 miles an hour around that curb. I know the roads well, so I guess I get a little lax sometimes when it comes to good driving. I'm looking at this dead doe, just trying to take it in that I almost destroyed my truck. Sigh. And then before I get back in the truck, I figure it might be a good idea to pop my hood and just double check to make sure everything is okay. I'm not sure if turning off and on real quick is some kind of safety mechanism or what, but I thought I'd be sure. I pop the hood and I start taking a quick gander to look and see if anything got damaged, bent, or popped out of place. Everything looked fine, and as I'm going to reach up to close the hood, I feel these dagger-like eyes on me. What I mean by that is, I felt the strongest feeling I've ever felt of somebody watching me. It didn't feel good though. It felt bad, like someone was 20 feet behind me, coming at me with a knife. I've never felt such immediate fear in my life. I turn around, and keep in mind my headlights are fully illuminating everything in front of me. Now, I see the dead deer still. I hear this growl that has so much bass to it. I freeze and tense up, thinking I just angered a huge bear or something. Out of the trees pops this huge wolf-looking face, but uglier. It takes one look at me, then looked down at the dead doe. It looked right back up at me without even breaking a second of eye contact. This huge hairy black arm reaches out below it and grabs the doe by the neck and pulls it back into the trees with it, never once breaking eye contact. It disappears altogether. I practically pissed myself. I was so terrified. Without even turning around, I just got back in my truck. The hood did get closed, and I flew out of there so fast. For some reason, my mind goes to a giant man-eating badger-looking thing, but it was very wolf-like. Absolutely huge head. I'm talking huge. I wanted to tell you about some interesting stories my friend told me about a part of the Yakima Reservation. I should give you some pre-information first. I live in eastern Washington, north of Yakima. The Yakima Reservation is a fairly small reservation, but borders from Yakima up to one side of Mount Adams. That alone is so interesting because of all the stuff that happens around that mountain, but I'll get to that in a minute. I feel confident in my wisdom and research of what I know about cryptids and such that I'm an avid researcher. I'm talking about Bigfoot, Skinwalkers, Chupacabra, Jersey Devil, Dogman, Wendigos, you name it. So, for me to have a friend who's a native and very much into his traditional side of things is a godsend. They too usually have their own stories and experiences with similar beings and things of the unknown. They are usually very spiritual people, very traditional, and by the roots, so to speak. Well, at least some of them are. Many of my friends are natives and from that same reservation, as well as their families. These are very traditional people, like I said, and what you can learn from them and their experiences is just breathtaking. Now, my close friend, he doesn't want me to mention his real name, even though I have his permission to tell these stories to you. We'll call him Terry. Terry grew up on the res his whole life and was very enriched in the tradition, language, and experiences, and has some incredible encounters himself along the way. Him and I both share an interest in the unknown, paranormal, and cryptids. However, he's scared beyond his wits when he has an experience or encounters. He firmly believes we weren't meant to come into contact with beings like this. They are far beyond our human level of comprehension, which is how he describes it. Terry, whom I've gotten to be close with many of his family, all have very similar experiences and things happen to them in their life too. I've talked with him and his family about Skinwalkers, if that's a thing up here in Washington, like I know it is down in Arizona. They do have similar stories, but they have a word for it that I can't quite remember what it was. I'll have to ask Terry again. It's one of those things they don't really like to bring up, because even mentioning them, more so during the night, is like calling out to these beings. Most of his immediate family was very hesitant to even talk about it, but here and there they would. Terry, though, has experienced something that isn't quite Skinwalker-like, and much more beastly, he likes to say. The first real experience he had when he explained that this large, angry-looking wolf that stood on two legs was stalking him and his brother out on a river one day fishing. He said it scared them so bad that they never went back to that same fishing spot. He's had a couple of friends mention that they've seen it driving at night, running across the road, or even watching them as they drive by. The next time he would have an encounter was with it when he was a little older and at a friend's house having a bonfire late at night. Him and his friends saw these large red eyes coming toward them from the tree line and a large silhouette of a tall wolf. He's seen it walking along the side of the road at nighttime, partially hidden by the tall grass. He's also had it stalk around his house before at night, trying to open all the door handles to get in and roaring loudly outside. The reservation police know about them and won't and refuse to deal with them. I guess his little brothers used to collect certain charms, and these charms would somehow draw these beings in more and more until Terry himself realized that what they were doing and made them get rid of them. As soon as that happened, they stopped coming around as much, but he would still see them from time to time. He won't tell me the kind of charms they are, in fear that I will go and seek out similar ones. They got them on the reservation. That much I do know. I believe it might have been something to do with black magic, as that's kind of what he hinted towards. I'm not 100% sure about myself. He has told me stories I'm not 100% sure myself. He has told me stories about people who he has known growing up, and how they play around with spirits of the dark and light. Says there are times when the spirits get drawn into the area. You'll know it too, because you can feel it in the air. It feels tense. He says there are other evil beings besides just what he has seen, which is what I think is a Dogman, based on his descriptions. He's told me about his friends seeing tall, skinny ones that are dark in color, and short ones too. They only come out in the middle of the night, and are just as equally frightening. I haven't heard anything about anyone being physically hurt. Even the stories I've been told about being tormented by these or other beings, it's just more terrorizing than it is harming. It's as if these beings are seeking this out, to scare and to terrorize the people they target. The other thing is that these beings, not just the one he's been seeing, but all of them seem to target a specific person. It's almost as if they're assigned to an individual or individuals. I've asked him if what he's seeing is a skinwalker, and he has knowledge on skinwalkers, but he knows them mainly from the Navajo religion and culture. But like he said, they do have similar beings up here with just different names. He tells me he really does not believe this being to be a skinwalker. He says it's a being of darkness, is how he describes it. But it is not the same being. He says it's the spirit of an evil wolf in the form of flesh. Him and his brothers and friends know about it and stay at certain spots in the woods. This includes hunting spots, fishing spots, shortcuts in the trails, game trails, things like that. There's certain areas they will only go during the day and avoid at night. They treat it very seriously. One thing I wanted to mention to you was that I said earlier it's interesting how the western part of the reservation ends on half of Mount Adams. This mountain has been notorious over the years for strange sightings of weird things, unexplainable things. Bigfoots have been spotted here countless times, even dating back to the 1800s. Washington State's history is rich with them. There's also talk about time and dimensional anomalies. Those stories are pretty interesting too. Of course, there's UFO sightings as well. There seems to be some sort of abnormal magnetic reading in certain spots along the mountain itself. I'm not sure how that ties in with everything, but it is interesting once you try to connect the dots. I will say that I think it has something to do with these beings showing up and having so many sightings. I know some of his other friends live closer to the mountain, and they talk about seeing this thing more often than not. Maybe it's drawn to a certain area more than others. From what I've gathered that he's told me is that the farthest east you go on the res, the less there are. I'll talk to more of his family and friends and see if I can't get some more stories for you, because it's very interesting. Maybe he is indeed seeing a dogman, and these beings are somehow attracted to him for whatever reason. I'll write back to you when I get a chance to actually talk to his family and friends more. Hi, what lurks beneath? It's me again. I know we haven't spoken in a few weeks, but I hope you're safe amidst all of this craziness. So, I got a chance to talk to my family and friends over the past 3 weeks about some of their personal encounters that they've each had. Terry has also had a couple of encounters with a Skinwalker and a Dogman. It's been a wild ride for sure, and it seems that as we are easing into spring, things are becoming a little more lively. Terry's family, whom again I am very close with, have had their fair share of recent experiences as well. Terry's grandmother, though, claims her to be guided by a great spirit and has had the most encounters out of everyone. She says nightly she'll be what she claims is tested among these beings. The angry wolf spirit constantly tries to get into their house, but can never, as she keeps everything locked. She refused to mention the name of their version of a Skinwalker, but told me they too will pay visits into the night. She explained that there has never been a time where there were multiples of these at her house at one time. It's always been one or the other, or other various creatures. She told me about some of them that are smaller and uglier, and some that are a greenish tint. Others are tall and lanky and dark. This same grandmother also lives on the very far western side of the res, not too far off from Mount Adams, actually. The worst experiences she has been having is with those wolf spirits. There is much dark magic being practiced in the res, she expressed to me. There are many individuals that are in poverty that she won't name in fear of word getting out that they call these beings into the reservation to cause fear to those who don't control the spirits. There's just certain members in the tribe you don't interact with. You don't want to make enemies at all. They are by far the most aggressive evil spirits she has encountered. She usually chants out a prayer to rid them of her house. Other things like burning sage act as a deflection against those kinds of things, but these spirits can cross that boundary. If given the opportunity, these things will kill, and they will do harm. The grandfather, Terry's grandfather, who passed away years ago, had many personal run-ins with these same beings when hunting. Mostly during the morning hours and dusk, but I guess he had a large scar running up his thigh and torso from when one of these things attacked him and almost gutted him like a pig. They were a common nuisance to deal with around the nighttime. There were times where he would be out hunting buck for meat, and these things would steal the kill from him, or get to the body before he could. It happened more than once, I was told about. The grandfather only ever got into one physical altercation with one of these things that we know of, and survived. He didn't kill it, but it attacked him and let him be. He tried to stab it, but Its hide was so thick, the knife wouldn't penetrate, he said. It was a predator that was meant to be feared. It sounded to me like he and many others know about this kind of being, along with things like skinwalkers and such, but they wouldn't ever mention it or talk about it, or even going as far as acknowledging their existence for the fact that they don't want to draw it in. It's really weird how secret they keep these things. Like I mentioned, they are very strict to the mantra of if you talk about it or give it energy, it will come to you. This grandfather has also had various encounters with the skinwalker as well, but when he was much younger. Those stories I wasn't told. The worst experience of his I was told about was when he was going to fish at a creek, a fishing spot he had found, and this wolf spirit was on the other side of the river, waiting to get to him. He saw the wolf spirit and it chased him. He fled and made it back, but this wolf spirit drove him out of that fishing spot. This was next to the worst time, other than being attacked. A quick note about the grandfather. He ended up dying from cancer years and years ago, so I never got to fully find out all the details to his story. Luckily for me, Terry's grandmother was able to recount to me much of the information I needed. That's about it as much as I basically know about the grandfather. Terry's younger brother, who is in his later 20s, has had some pretty bad ones too. One time, his car was attacked by multiples of these wolf spirits while he was out in the woods driving around. It was nighttime, and they surrounded his vehicle and even bit and popped one of his tires. They were trying to pull him out of the car, clawing at the windows and trying to pull the car door handle. I don't know how he made it back, but he apparently was riding on a partially existing tire, sparks and all. He had even had encounters with these things while he was back in high school. This huge, hairy, wolf-looking beast would watch him walk home every day from the tree line. He would recite his prayers out loud the whole walk to keep it at bay, in fear of it reaching out and trying to grab him and take him away. This was before he knew about these beings, really, but still understood that they were evil. They have all had so many similar accounts and experiences. They've all had their fair share of seeing this out at night, by the road, crossing the road, looking into their windows, you name it. Terry's mother has even recalled nights where she would wake up out of fear and terror and have to go stand out on the front porch and chant prayers to ward off this thing's energy and knowing that it was around their house. His mother also talks about when she was younger, being visited by this thing, by this being, when she was alone in her room. Even when she went to friends' houses, this thing was always finding a way to show up. Something I expressed with not only Terry, but his grandmother, mother and brothers is that from these stories, these wolf spirits have so many opportunities to kill and do far worse. Why don't they? All of them agree and aren't sure. They believe, other than the grandmother, that these beings are meant to incite fear and torment the person that they are sent after. The grandmother believes that these are much more nefarious beings, and given the right chance, they will kill, even though no one besides the grandfather in the family had gotten physically hurt in any way. I've kindly told them about my findings into cryptozoology, and what these beings, what they are actually describing, are dogmen. They are intrigued but still hold true to all of their beliefs that this is some demonic spirit coming after them, and it's important to stay away. One thing that has always struck a weird chord with me is there's so much tying together cryptids and Native American culture and shamanism. I am still trying to find the connection myself. I was even told that there are so-called experts on these beings from some of the elders in the tribe, but they won't talk about it, especially to me, a white boy. So I'll just have to keep researching and digging out what I can. As fascinating as all this truly is, it is also simply terrifying that these beings seem to be targeting not just Terry's family, but many families in the tribe and the reservation. If I find out anything more worth writing to you about, I'll write you in. Stay safe. For starters, I live up a tall mountain grade. Long, slender, winding roads for about 7 miles. Just a small guardrail on the same side of the road. Very steep incline going up, with grass, lots of rocks, and the occasional deer. One night I was driving up it, and the moon was out in full, so the valley and the mountainside and everything was fully lit up. To my left, I saw this large black mass heading right towards the road down the hill. It was moving quick, almost gliding. I start to slow down in anticipation because maybe it's a big deer or a bear. But then this thing jumps into the road and then jumps over the guardrail to the right of me, further down the mountain. I only saw it for a second, but it scared the hell out of me, and I knew it wasn't natural. When it jumped out into the middle of the road, it landed directly in front of my headlights, so it was fully illuminated for just a second before it jumped over the guardrail. It was a large gray-black timber wolf, the largest wolf I'd ever seen, and it moved with incredible speed. The thing that bothered me the most was as it was racing down the mountainside so quickly, that it was so steep, so I don't know how it managed to do that without tumbling forward. Like I said, even its movements looked off. It looked to be gliding rather than running, and I'm not sure how it could do that with moving its limbs. I caught the glimpse of this shape about 3 seconds before it came in contact with the road. I didn't know we had wolves like that out here. I just listened to one of your Dogman videos you made a while back. It was the one where the guy had grandparents that owned a large farm, and the grandfather would have to start sacrificing his cattle and livestock by tying them up on the far side of the farm to keep these dogmen at bay. My grandparents owned a big ranch in California that they would do very similar things. I don't remember much about it because I was younger, but I do remember my grandparents every week or so. Well, maybe it was more than that, but I know it was often. They would take one of their cattle and take it out to a very specific spot far into the backwoods on my grandparents' ranch and leave them there, only one at a time. They would disappear and be gone. My grandfather would do this often, and he would alternate between cattle, pigs, goats, whatever he could find. He was constantly getting new livestock, and I never knew why at the time. Come to find out when I was older, and he had a couple of drinks and loosened up, that he'd been dealing with a predator problem that was much worse than a mountain lion or a coyote. That these animals were coming in and taking his cattle and other livestock whole. He would never tell me what it was. I remember asking him, and he still wouldn't tell me. He just explained to me that it was stuff of nightmares, and things a young boy like me at the time should never see. I had no idea what that meant. This is why they sacrificed their livestock to ensure their other livestock stayed alive. I still remember that conversation well, even when I was 15. Grandfather and grandmother passed just about 4 to 5 years after that, both having massive heart attacks due to being heavy smokers. That was pretty much that. And then I heard in that episode you released, and I connected the dots. I had no idea there were other farmers out there that have to do the same stuff. I couldn't tell you if he had heard any howls or seen anything weird, but my grandfather acted strange when we would talk about it. A kind of strange where you know somebody knows something that bothers them, but they won't tell you what it is. That episode makes sense to me, and I'm sure that's what it could have been. Gosh, just thinking about it makes my skin still crawl. I've got a tale for you. Still scares me shitless to think about, because what I saw should just plainly not exist. Period. I believe one of these Dogman creatures tried to take my 3-year-old son. Well, 3 years old at the time. He's 10 now. At the time, we lived in Indiana. I was with a company that moved me around every year or so. It was just me and my 3-year-old son in a smaller 2-bedroom, 1-bath house that we were renting. We had neighbors, but they weren't close by. We had a lot of cherry and apple trees in our yard. That much I do remember. So much so that it blocked views of neighbors and even the road, and was nice because it gave us a needed touch of privacy. My son's room at the time is facing the back end of the house, where my room is just on the other end of the hallway. One night I was sleeping, woke up to the sound of noise coming from outside my window, moving towards the back end of the house. Thinking it was somebody outside my house trying to break in, it was getting closer to my son's room, where the direction of the noise was coming from. I went into straight dad mode, grabbed my loaded shotgun that I keep locked away in my closet at night, ran down to my son's room, thinking somebody was trying to break in. I'm running down my hall, and I could start to hear, clear as day, my son screaming, and I busted the door open. My son is screaming his head off at whatever the hell I was looking at outside of his window. Standing there with the most red, haunting eyes was this animal that looked like it came from hell. Just a huge wolf face staring right at my son. I pointed my shotgun right at the window. The motion of me moving must have caught its attention because it quickly glanced over at me, and its expression went from a sinister to an "oh shit, I've been caught" kind of expression. It disappeared within a split second from the window. My son was in hysterics, and so I'm trying to console him. He slept with me for the next few weeks, too scared to even go back in his own room by himself. We never saw that thing after that. I only stayed in that house for another 5 months, and then moved again to Nevada, where I finished out my last 2 years of my time with that company. My son, being 10 now, has an interest in things unknown, and still being in Nevada, has friends that talk about Skinwalkers, and are friends with friends in the Navajo, so he thinks it's super cool. He is one of those who actually told me about Dogman, Bigfoot, and all those creatures in more detail, because he's just so into cryptozoology. I'm really surprised because he doesn't even remember that night or what happened. Thank God, because I sure do. I wish I could forget it.